The 50th anniversary of the Pascagoula alien abduction case, which we have talked at length before about here on this show, is coming up in October the 11th. It's one of the most famous cases we've ever covered on this show. And I think it's about a decade or so since I first spoke to the one living person who was one of the two principals in this case, Calvin Parker, who, along with Charlie Hickson, essentially said that they were abducted on that night and taken up into a ship, and they were tended to, experimented upon, by aliens. The Washington Post wrote it this way. What is certain about the night of October the 11th, 1973 is this. When Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker Jr. arrived at the Sheriff's Department in Pascagoula, Mississippi, they were frantic. They told authorities they'd just been abducted by aliens. Each had a puncture wound in one arm. Police tried to catch them in a lie, but it didn't work. Both men later passed polygraph tests. In June 2019, the riverbank where the men said the close encounter happened got an historical marker, calling it one of the best documented cases of alien abduction ever. After decades of avoiding media attention, Parker was there for the dedication that day. Charlie Hickson, of course, died in 2011. It's an extraordinary story, made even more so by new witnesses and new evidence that is still coming out to this day, as you will hear in this hour tonight, along with some exclusive video and audio never before broadcast. Now, it's all based on Philip Mantle and Irina McCammon Scott's book, It's Here Beyond Reasonable Doubt. This book is now available, and I commend it to you. If I flip through the pages there, you can see how much information is there. It is full of testimony, photographs, police records, newspaper stories, everything in there. It is a one-stop shop. I think it is the definitive work on this particular incident. And I thank you to Philip Mantle for sending me a copy of that book. Now, a little later this hour, we'll hear from Irina. Philip is on first. Philip, thanks very much for coming on.
Well, my pleasure, Howard. Nice to speak to you again.
We've got some stuff to give our audience tonight, haven't we, Philip?
Yeah, it's a question of, when we were discussing this, exactly what to choose, because there is so much, Howard, and obviously we're going to get a little bit of a taster of that this evening.
What is the fascination, do you think, of this story? Because it's captivated and gripped you for years, hasn't it?
Yeah, I first read about it back in the 1980s in a magazine, and it was so different and so bizarre. As you've just mentioned, within hours of the incident happening, both gentlemen were in the Sheriff's Department being interrogated and then recorded secretly. That was Sheriff Fred Diamond and his deputy Glenn Ryder, and both have been, interviewed down the years. Sadly, they're no longer with us. But Glenn Ryder, for example, the deputy, didn't believe a word of it until he heard what's known as a secret tape. Basically, Charlie and Calvin were put in a room by themselves. They were left alone. What they didn't know, in the desk next to them was a tape recorder playing, taping the conversation. The deputy came back a few minutes later, took it and thought, we'll get them now, lads, But absolutely not. I mean, Calvin, when you listen to it or you read the transcript, it was literally crawling up the walls. And it was then that their attitude, the law enforcement attitude, changed when they listened to this tape. And of course, 2 days, the very next day, they were sent to Singing River Hospital for an exam. Everything was okay. But on that night, in October the 11th, the first phone call they made was to Keesler Air Force Base, which is nearby, who basically gave them the brush off. However, the following morning, they were sent to Keesler Air Force Base to be checked for radiation. And the military people there said, well, while you're here, why don't you tell us what happened? And we have a full copy, a full transcript of the meeting that day. They didn't have a tape recorder there. They had a stenographer. So we have it, and we have all the names of who was there, the lot. And, this is the very next day. So these things are unique, Howard. If you think about Betty and Barney Hill, their experience wasn't relived until years later, several years later. when they met Dr. Benjamin Simon, who put them under regressive hypnosis. Here you have Charlie and Calvin, you know, in the sheriff's office within a couple of hours of this happening, telling them what they'd experienced. And, you know, they said, especially Glenn Ryder, said on several TV interviews that, you know, especially Calvin was scared half to death.
This is the thing. Not only did they have physical signs, but they also were traumatized. You know, they were traumatized in a way that it would be very difficult for somebody who was making it up to fake.
Absolutely. And Calvin was traumatized all his life. He's still traumatized to this very day. It wasn't until 2018 when he wrote his own book, which I published, that he finally told his wife and family the full story. It was just one of those things they knew not to ask him about, you know, and it was, you know, don't mention it, you know, especially with kids. Oh, don't mention that to Dad.
And in fact, Calvin moved around a lot, didn't he, to try and avoid the glare of publicity?
I mean, this may seem strange in today's society, but Calvin had recently become engaged to his childhood sweetheart, Wynette. He didn't want this story getting out because he thought her father wouldn't let him marry her, you know, and he was worried about that. And they got married in November. What not a lot of people know is that shortly after, Calvin joined the United States Marine Corps. Not because he particularly wanted to be a Marine, but he thought in the Marines he would escape because they were being hounded by journalists, newspapers. You know, Charlie Hickson was fine dealing with the newspapers and the media. He accepted it, but not Calvin. He wanted nothing to do with it. There was a number of times he asked Charlie just to stop it. Don't keep this up. I want to forget about it. And if you remember the TV series of the Hulk in the 1980s, you know, Dr. Bruce Banner or Dr. David Banner, there was a journalist hunting him, and he was the Hulk, of course. And every time the journalist caught up, he would move to the next town. Well, Calvin was the real life. That's exactly what he did. His wife and at one point, 2 young children. And there was one place he went to work, Howard. He even used a false name. And the boss called him into the office one day and said, your name doesn't match your social security number. You're fired, you know? And it wasn't until 2018 he went to a funeral of a friend. And as he's coming out of the church, they're writing a book of condolence, and he wrote Calvin Parker.
Oh.
And then behind him, people seeing the name was the winks and the nudges. So his wife, Wynette, said, look, you know, enough's enough. Why don't you write a book? And he said, yes, darling. You know, just to placate her, really, if we're honest, Howard. And then out of the blue, he got a phone call from me. I had got the permission to republish Charlie Hickson's book that he wrote with William Mendez in '93. And I was looking to see if I could get an interview with Calvin, that's all, bring things up to date. And we chatted, and he was very polite, but he didn't tell me an awful lot. You know, I wasn't getting anywhere with him, Howard. But on the second phone call, he just said, oh, well, you know, I'm thinking of writing a book. And I said, well, you know, I can help you with that. So he had me on one side here, and he had his wife, Wynette, got him in a headlock across there in Pascagoula. So he decided to do it, and there were conditions attached. I wasn't allowed to edit it. I wasn't allowed to change anything. He had last say on everything we did. And you know, and he, in the end, he wished he'd done it, you know, earlier. You could almost feel the relief of getting the story out there, because Calvin now is sadly very ill, or otherwise we'd have him on here tonight.
Indeed, and it's very sad because that was part of the plan, wasn't it? We were going to get Calvin on, and he's very seriously ill at the moment, so my good wishes and thoughts go out to him. But I have interviewed him a couple of times, and what I always say when I've done those interviews is that I can see no reason why this man would fabricate this story. If you speak to him this year, the story is the same as it was 3 years ago. It doesn't change. Now, people who are making stuff up, their story changes. Overlay that with the fact that his demeanour is that of a very sincere man telling a true story that he wants to unburden himself of. And for those three reasons, I believe him. You know, I do, and I don't care what people think. That's my view of it. This is the 50th anniversary.
Calvin's view on it is, if you don't believe me, I don't care.
Now, you know, we can dispute what it was that he got involved in, how that happened, but the fact that he went through something, I think some people may disagree with me, but I think is beyond dispute. Now, tonight, the reason we're doing this tonight, not only is it the book, the 50th anniversary, but we've got some information that you've kindly provided and some audio and video clips here that have not been heard before, as far as I'm aware. So let's start. After the two men are interviewed by the cops and secretly recorded, and surprise, surprise, they're sticking to their story when they're put in a private room. The microphone is recording them. They don't know it. They don't say, I think we're getting away with this one. They talk about their trauma and what happened to them both. Yeah. This is Sheriff Diamond, and I think it's important that we hear him. The audio quality is not fantastic, but it's perfectly understandable. This is him speaking, I think, is it the day after?
The day after.
Right.
Well, the interviewer came looking for Charlie and Calvin, and of course they were at the hospital being examined. And like news reporters, they needed a story, so the next best option was the sheriff. And this was the morning after.
Here he is.
This same object that was supposed to have picked these two men up was spotted about 45 minutes earlier up near the Van Cleve area. It was also spotted by 2 or 3 people in Pascagoula.
In other words, Sheriff Diamond, you've had, I know we talked to Deputy Glenn Ryder earlier this morning. There have been quite a few reports of this UFO in our area, and approximately at the same time that these two men have stated that they were taken aboard.
That's very true. They even give us a description of the creatures, whichever we might want to call them. It was a boarding craft. They give a good description of them. They seemed to be around 5 foot tall. They were real wrinkled and had sharp ears, sharp nose, and their mouth was very near the end of the nose. They were horrible creatures from the description we got from them.
Sheriff Diamond there. And I'm so pleased we've been able to hear that radio station interview, or that little clip of it, because he sounds like he's completely on side with it, that not that he believes them, but he thinks it's a credible story, yeah?
No, he did believe them. I mean, he didn't when they first turned up. I mean, we can understand the skepticism, but after speaking to them and seeing the state of them, he believes them. And one of the criticisms that I constantly get is, oh, no one else saw anything at the time. Well, you've just heard the sheriff there saying, we got more reports here in Van Cleve and other places. And what is interesting, you have to remember, after the abduction, Charlie and Calvin were driving home, and Charlie had a change of heart. They weren't going to tell anybody. So they pulled in a payphone, phoned Kiesler, they give him the brush off. So they phoned the police department, and the police dispatcher who took the call is actually the son of Fred Diamond. Now, the sheriff is long since gone, but the dispatcher is still alive, and we've communicated with him, and he said, I took at least 50 calls of UFO sightings that night, Philip, at least 50 plus. And he said, I wrote them all down in the log. They were all handed in at the end of my shift. He says, and when I went back to the police station, there were people there in person reporting it as well. And what's interesting, Howard, he said there was even a clergyman there. Now, we found out, from newspaper archives that there was indeed a clergyman involved. He was called Pastor Emmanuel Sigalis. And he was a friend of a chap called Raymond Broadhurst, who worked for the Police and Probation Service. And on that night of 11th of October, Pastor Sigalis, Mr. Broadhurst, and a church volunteer, this was a church meeting they were going to, called Joanne Hallmark. She was sat in the back of the car. It was a kind of meeting, for people with drinking problems. And as they're driving out of the town, guess what? Flew straight across them. In front of them, on the highway, heading in the general direction of where Parker and Hickson was. And my colleague, Stefanos Panagiotakis, in Greece in 1981, interviewed Mr. Sigalis. And it was, like I said, we got newspaper cuttings about it from the time, but the lady in the back of the car had disappeared. She wasn't in Pascagoula for a long time. She wasn't a native of the area, and she called Joanne Hallmark. Anyway, we tracked her down about a year or so later to Maryland, and we told her what we were looking for, and she remembered it all and gave us an interview. So we had the information from these sightings from 1973, an interview with the pastor in 1981, and then Joanne Hallmark a couple of years ago.
And there are other elements to this story too, which we'll get to later this hour, including a woman called Maria Blair, who I did a telephone interview with at home on Friday. This was a very new witness. Her and her husband, Jerry, were very much part of this. So this is a gift, this story that keeps on giving. People are appearing, people are remembering, people are telling you. Now, another element in this, which is very important, and one of the main reasons we're doing this again now, is the hypnotic regression that you did on Calvin Parker. And for the first time on television, in the next segment of this show, after we've taken commercials, you will see clips from that hypnotic regression. You will be able to decide for yourself. So we're talking with Philip Mantle. We're talking about the 50th anniversary of Pascagoula. The reason we're doing this is because there is a whole a stash of information that Philip Mantle, the author of this new book, which is Beyond Reasonable Doubt, has sent to me and allowed me to use here tonight. Philip Mantle and Irina McCammon Scott. The foreword is by Calvin Parker himself. It's all in there, but some of the video and audio material that this is based on, you will be seeing and hearing tonight, including video from the hypnotic regression of Calvin Parker. Now, this has been talked about. We've read about it. I've read transcripts of it, but I've never actually seen it. And Philip, you organised this, didn't you?
Yes, I mean, Calvin's been under hypnosis, you know, a couple of times, and we have some tape recordings of it or some audio. And a few photographs of him, you know, during the process. But again, one of the things I talked about with Calvin was he wanted to leave a legacy. Like I said, he's God bless him, his days are numbered, but he wanted to leave a legacy. And we had the opportunity to employ a local professional hypnotherapist, and she put him under hypnosis. And for me, one of the highlights of it was seeing the look on her face, Howard, because she didn't know what was about to come. You know, I did, and there were no questions prepared in advance. Whether Calvin's, you know, sat there in front of a microphone or is under hypnosis, you only need to ask him a question and away he goes. You know, so we know how. And I had a professional cameraman to film it as well. So we have it on 2 cameras, we have the complete audio of it and visual, and it is preserved now for posterity. I know it's a contentious subject, using regressive hypnosis, I'm fully aware of that, but like all the data that we've put in the book, all we've said is make up your own mind about it. We're not trying to tell you anything. It's all there, you choose. You
sent me an awful lot of material. We've boiled it down tonight, and this is by no means all of it, into 4 clips. So let's work our way through these clips. This is Calvin Parker under hypnotic regression. This is recent, and this is exactly as it happened. Let's see the first of the clips.
I'm looking at the walls, and the lights coming out of the walls are a softer light now. It's blue. And I don't see no bulbs, no fixtures. And we made a left turn and went about 15 foot down the hall, which was a wide hall. It was probably 8-foot hallway wide. And we come to a door. And I remember stopping at the door. And this is the first time that I got a view of what had a hold of me. And I couldn't see nothing but the skin, the face features, kind of grayish looking color.
Okay, very good. Describe as much as you can about what it looks like.
This thing was gray looking color. He didn't have no neck. And I can't make out no face on it at the moment.
Interesting to hear him recount that, isn't it? This is what happened to him, he says, on board the craft. And the predominant colour being blue, that's interesting because people who sighted whatever this thing was over Pascagoula, all of them say this was blue. So that's pretty significant. No sense of the terror, though, the trauma that, you know, was reflected in his encounters with police.
I think in one of the earlier tapes that we did, Calvin was put under hypnosis by the late Bud Hopkins in 1993. And on that tape, you hear Calvin scream. And I know because I sat and listened to it and transcribed it. And it came as quite a shock. But different hypnotherapists use different techniques, Howard, to try and take that fear, not the emotion away from it, but the fear. So, you know, what we're having in the, as they do the induction going down before they're actually under hypnosis, they're making them aware that there's nothing to be frightened of, etc., etc. And there's different techniques to do that, I'm led to believe. So you don't always hear the fear, but there's a reason for it. You want to know clearly what they're seeing. But like I say, on the tape with Bud Hopkins, he lets out a scream, I can assure you. And it's not a pleasant thing to hear. The only time I ever heard that similar, Howard, was I was in A&E in Leeds in the hospital. I was in a cubicle there, and sadly a young man had had a road traffic accident and had passed away, and his mum was sat by his bed and she screamed.
So, you know, that's real life trauma. And, you know, this is a very sober and very measured account, but it's a very clear narrative. Let's see now the second of these clips. We've got 4. Here's number 2.
Well, I don't know that it's a her. She don't have she don't have no breast. And she has longer arms than most humans. And I noticed her fingers on each hand.
Okay.
But she does have on clothes. She has very little hair, but she does have hair. And it's, again, the room is blue and orange. So it makes her hair look kind of purplish looking.
Okay.
She has a mouth and eyes and ears and nose like the other one didn't have. She looks normal.
So this was one of a few kinds of creatures or aliens that he encountered. And this particular creature that was involved, I think, in the actual experiments or whatever they were doing on him was humanoid in character.
Was female, you know, and the only slight difference was the middle finger was somewhat longer and come to a point, and she put that in his mouth and up into his navel cavity, and it hurts. Calvin was none best pleased about that. And the other creatures, as you hear him describe him, were the bulky creatures, long arms, pincers. Calvin just nicknames them the big uglies. You know, that's just typical Southern humour, big ugly guy. And he was stood over in the corner, and he said he felt this presence at first, and he felt it was a female presence, and he couldn't understand that, you know. And she said to him, we call it telepathy, for want of a better word. We won't hurt you or anything like that. And but that wasn't exactly true. And at this point, I mean, Calvin's laying on this glass table. He cannot move. The only thing he can move is his eyes, you know, and he's trying to describe things in the best way he can. So there were two very distinctly different looking creatures, beings, whatever you want to call them.
Okay, I want to get through these video clips because they are entrancing in many ways. So let's go to number 3 now. This is the third item.
And I do hear a noise.
Okay.
I hear a drip, drip, drip. Sound like I'm bleeding, or feels warm, like blood coming out from my hand. She's draining the blood out for some reason.
Okay.
And I think she's replacing it with something. I'm getting weak and weaker and weaker. And I get to the stage where I don't care if I live or die.
Keep going.
But I feel something coming in from my foot and blood going out my hand.
So Calvin there is saying under hypnosis that blood is being taken from him and it is being replaced by something else. Were there signs of this when he was examined in 1973 after the event?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things we have in the book is Charlie Hickson felt he had, when they first got over him, they pricked his arm. Calvin, during that session there, said that they removed his clothes, his lower clothes and his shoes and socks, and they stuck something in his foot and it hurt. I'm cutting a lot, I know it's short of time, but we found a document in the Centre for UFO Studies archive that we call the puncture wounds document. It was done on the 13th of October, so 2 days after the event, and both gentlemen stripped to their underwear, and someone gives them a quick once-over and writes a report mentioning that is these marks on Charlie's arm and on Calvin's foot. And it then says photographs were taken. Now, the photographs weren't in this file. However, they turned up a couple of years further down the line, and there you see, you know, these black and white photographs of marks on Charlie's arm, on marks on underneath Calvin's foot. And we know which picture is which because the names and the dates written on the reverse side of them. These are not digital photographs, they're the old-fashioned ones. And for me, Howard, when you have the witness testimony, and then you have this document called Puncture Wounds document, which we believe was written by Dr. James Harder, and then followed on by the photographs, I think that put together, that's something, a compelling piece of evidence. On their own, they're not a lot, but when you put them together, I think they are very compelling. I mean, when the photographs came, was a gentleman by the name of Mark Rodiger at QFOS that sent them to me. He said, Philip, I've been going through some files. I found these today. I wasn't looking for them, but I assume you've got them anyway, but I thought I'd better send them. And when I opened my email, I was just sat there with my mouth open. You know, my wife thought I'd having another heart attack. You know, something had gone wrong. But I was stunned. I never thought we'd find them. And for me, it's, again, a fascinating piece of evidence.
And that's why your new book with Irina, McCammon, Scott, who we'll hear after the next set of commercials, I think. That's why your new book is so comprehensive. I said I wanted to get to all 4 of these video clips. This is by no means the entire contents, I have to stress here, but they're a good taster. Let's get to number 4.
She pretty much is through with me. I got the strength. The big one helped me up, and I put my clothes back on voluntarily. And for some reason, I wasn't afraid no more. Oh. I was mad. And I threw her against the wall when she come back the second time. And I was beating her head against the wall. And the big ugly one. And I called him out because I couldn't make it out. Gave me some kind of something. I could hear the psh again. And I just went limp. And the next thing I knowed, I was standing outside by the river.
And that's how it all ended. They obviously prepared him. They got him to put his clothes back on. They slipped him something that made him feel calmer about it, it seems. And that was it. It's pretty compelling. You know that there will be people who say that's just random stuff stored away in the brain. That is no indication of anything. But of course, as you would say, Philip, and I think you'd be right, with all the circumstantial evidence, those photographs that you talked about and all the other stuff that's in this book, that makes a much more compelling case.
It does. And I asked Calvin what he felt about hypnosis, and to be honest, he wasn't that bothered about it. He says, I can remember everything anyway. You know, he said it clarified one or 2 points. What is interesting about this recent video, right at the beginning, we haven't shown it here tonight because it doesn't mean a lot, but I said to the hypnotherapist, one of the few questions I put to her, just before anything kicks off, they're standing on this little broken down pier with their rods in the water, they're fishing. What does Calvin say? Just ask him to tell me what he sees around him. So he says, as he said before, he says, there's a boat going out to sea. I don't know how these big metal boats float. There's the bridge over there. And a little throwaway comment, Howard. He said, oh, there's 2 figures on the other side of the river. And I asked that question, and I don't know the answer. Are those 2 figures the other witnesses, Mr. and Mrs. Blair, who were watching back at what was going on with him and Charlie?
And who we knew nothing about until 2018. 50th anniversary of the Pascagoula incident. Calvin Parker, Charlie Hickson abducted by aliens, they say. Lots of evidence coming out and more witnesses appearing. We'll be hearing very soon from Maria Blair, who only appeared in 2018. We'll tell the story of that with Irina McCammon Scott, Philip Mantle's co-author on their new book, Pascagoula Beyond Reasonable Doubt. Just before we get to Irina, though, Philip, I want to ask you about the stash of material that you were gifted from Charles Hickson. Was this from Charles Hickson's estate?
You could call it that. It came from us by a lady by the name of Chelsea Norton Prince, who runs the Ocean Springs Historical Society. And it was one of their members, a lady by the name of Bethany Fayard, who said, I've got these 2 boxes of material. Bethany's mum and dad actually bought Charlie Hickson's house when he passed away, and everything was left in it. And they had these boxes of papers. They had more than they've given to us, but I think some were given away earlier. So they had 2 plastic bins, and she didn't know what to do with them. She thought, I'll donate them to the Historical Society. Just as Chelsea had an interest in the Pascagoula case and knew of me. She'd even met Calvin at one point, and she contacted me and said, would you like copies? And I said, yes, please, you know. And she said, well, I've got some kind of equipment that'll scan things in pretty quickly. Do you want everything? I said, whatever's in envelopes, the lot, just scan it, you know. And a lot of it is, you know, just people writing to Charlie trying to buy a book or whatever. But there's lovely little snippets of history in it as well, Howard. What sprang out of all this material, and I haven't gone through it all yet, but what came out first was there is a handwritten list. It's bullet points, 1 to 20, written by Charlie Hickson, describing the creatures bit by bit, how long he thought the point out their nose was, what their chest, you know, was 44 inches. 1 bulletproof at a time. 1 bullet point, I should say. Now, when you listen to Charlie and Calvin when this thing initially landed, and they had 2 lights on it, and this opening appeared. Now, the whole thing baffled them, but being engineers, this opening puzzled them even more, because it appeared if it was there, and then it wasn't, you know. So Charlie seems to have tried to make a few drawings of this opening, and then there is a full-on sketch of the UFO, never seen before anywhere. I mean, there's letters to him from well-known people like Betty Hill. Betty's reporting some other sightings she had. some well-known UFO researchers or UFO groups reporting things to him, as well as members of the public saying, Charlie, you know, in 19 whatever, this happened to me. But it's a lovely snapshot of history, and we're very grateful to Chelsea for sending this. Like I said, I think there's about, it's amazing that I've gone through about 400 items so far. I think there's another 1,100 to go.
Gee, well, you'll be kept busy for the next year or two. There was also, astonishingly enough, and I'm not sure how this thing got made, but a 45 RPM record, a single as we used to call them, if you remember those, a single record which is Charles Hickson talking about what happened. And we've got a clip, and thank you for it. We've got a clip of that. Let's just hear it.
The craft hovered about 2 foot from the ground, and almost instantly an opening appeared at one end. And there's no way for me to express the feelings I had when these three things appeared in that opening. My God, Calvin, what's happening? I'll never forget those words. As I glanced toward Calvin, he seemed to be going in shock. These 2 inches tall, the head seemed to come directly to the shoulders without a neck. The nose was about 1.5 inches long, and he came to a point. The ears were similar to the nose, maybe a little longer. And directly under the nose was a slit. It resembled a mouth. There could have been eyes. I can't recall what they looked like. Their skin, or it could have been some type of clothing, reminds me of elephant skin. And it was very wrinkled. And it seemed to shine. The arms resembled human arms, but the hands were webbed with something like a thumb, more like pincers. And the arms were long in proportion to the body. The legs remained together. And the feet seemed to be round, like an elephant's foot. And these things seemed to glide about the same height from the ground as the craft, and almost instantly were upon us. 2 of them took hold of my arms from the side.
Amazing to hear Charles Hickson there, and thank you very much for giving me that sound. And I love the Johnny Cash reverb on it. It's very, very good. An amazing find. Listen, we've kept her waiting. Irina McCammon Scott, your co-author here, is also waiting. So, Philip, if you can hold on there while I talk to Irina. Irina, thank you so much for coming on. Good to see your face. How are you?
Okay, great.
Maria, you have contributed so much to this book, but the thing that grabbed me, and I've done an interview with this person myself, as you have done, was the conversation that you had with Maria Blair. Now, what nobody knew until 2018 was that it is claimed Hickson and Parker were not the only 2 people to have seen this, or indeed to have been abducted on that night, right?
Right. When I first started talking to her, it was just cold. Calvin had been on the YouTube, and one of their daughters had written and said their parents had been on the other side of the river and had seen something, but at that time they didn't know what it was. And later they did. But so Philip gave me the phone number of the mother, and I called her, and she said that what they had observed is that they were sitting on, well, the husband was going to go out on a ship working, and they were sitting in the dock because the ship was going to come in. It was late, or the person that the captain or whoever, his supervisor, I think, was late. And so they were sitting there waiting, and the man went to sleep. Well, the wife said she saw this, what she considered to be an airplane, and it was just flying around, but it didn't go anyplace. It just go here and go there. And she kept saying, well, the pilot was lost. I mean, the pilot didn't know where he was going. He was confused. And then she said that her husband said, we'll walk on down the pier and go to the boat. And so they walked down the pier, and her husband was ahead of her. And she said that as they were walking down, that this thing that looked like a man flopped up on the pier right in front of her, right beside her. and then flopped down in the water and never came up again. And she was very, very emotional about that. But then she said it was about 9 o'clock and they went on down to the boat. And then she said later she came back to the car and she said it was 12 o'clock. And I wondered what on earth they were doing in the boat for that long. And she said she was really, really, really scared. And she ran all the way back to the car. Well, I interviewed her several more times, and I was trying to find out why she was so emotional about this thing that flopped out in front of her. And boy, I mean, she was really scared and really emotional, but she didn't seem to have any idea why. And her husband is sort of skeptical. And I talked to him briefly, and he thought, you know, he was saying nothing happened. You know, this was, you know, nothing. Maybe it was a porpoise or something, and maybe a blimp was flying around or something. And then, unfortunately, he became very sick, and very unfortunately, he died. But before he died, he said he wanted to get something off his chest, and he told her that they had been abducted, and that he apparently knew about it. I mean, he didn't want to say anything because he was a working person. He didn't want to get fired, and, you know, he needed his job and everything. And so he hadn't talked about it before. But he said he remembered the beings, and he apparently had been in contact with them before that, but he never told her anything about it. So he described an abduction where he was on board, and it apparently was about the same. It was apparently... They thought it was after the Calvin and Charlie abduction, but they weren't sure. And then that he called one of them the doctor, and she thought that he didn't like this man, this whatever the thing was, and that maybe he'd done something physical to him or something.
No, exactly. And I had a chance to speak with Maria on Friday. She doesn't use internet, so we did it by telephone. But it was a fascinating conversation because, tell me if I'm right, the detail from Maria's side, Jerry apparently knew much more than Maria could recall about all of this. And he, of course, wanted to unburden himself before his sad departure, which he did. And then Maria was put under hypnotic regression herself, and more came out about that, about it all. Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty spooky. One thing about it was, I don't think if she didn't remember very well of being on board. She said she opened her eyes a little bit when she was outside, but she said they asked her why the things were here, and she said, well, they wanted eggs, and they wanted her eggs.
Okay, well, that is a very good point to get into. Just a little clip from the conversation that I had with Maria. I did half an hour with Maria. I will put it on my podcast within the next week, but this is just 2 minutes of the conversation I had on Friday with Maria Blair.
I just didn't want them being around me. I didn't want them touching me. I just want them to go on, leave me alone, but that didn't happen. I still feel scared about it because it was something that happened so suddenly, and I didn't know what they were. My husband did, but I didn't. And I was only like 23 years old at the time, so the world was still new to me out there, and seeing something like that was really shocking. And could I have it happen again? No, I wouldn't.
If they were harvesting DNA material from human beings, and from you in particular, I'm sure you have, but have you ever over the years given thought to the fact that there might be some hybrid human/alien person walking around that has elements of you in it?
Definitely. And I'm pretty sure there probably is. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that they did get some of my eggs, and I'm pretty sure that things happened that I don't know. There's something in my mind that I know something happened or something went on that I can't just put my finger on it and place it. It's just there, but I just can't know what it is. It's like being kept from me. And I always thought that my husband knew exactly what happened to me, but I still say he kept things from me for all them years. Because he knew, because he was alert. He was alert to what was going on. I wasn't. They kept me under, and he was I still say he still knows something that when he died, he didn't tell me. I still think that.